Welcome everyone! I am so excited because today we are going to be looking at the truth behind the Greek myths and exploring the heroic age of Greece. Now, what is the heroic age of Greece? All right? Well, what I'm referring to is the age of heroes within Greece. And we're going to be talking about the mythology. We're going to be investigating the truth behind it. What's the history behind these myths? Were they real? Was there some truth to them? We'll be looking at that, but we'll also be looking at what the heroic age did for Greece. How did it affect these people to live in a very unique time of idealization of heroes? And how did that change the course of not only the Greek history, but of human history in Western civilization? Right? We are talking about, when we talk about the Greeks, we are talking about one of, if not the most influential people in the history of the human race. All right? There is a reason why everyone across the planet has heard of Heracles, has heard of Perseus, has heard of the Minotaur and of Theseus, from Argentina to China to India, all the way to Canada. Across the whole span of the earth, people know about the myths of these heroes from over 3,000 years ago. That is how influential not only the Greeks were, but how influential their myths were themselves. Now, what is a myth, right? We think about myths. Myths and the human story are one, right? You look at Greece, you look at North America with the Native Americans there, anywhere you look, right? Myth has served for thousands of years as both the origins that situate its humanity within its relationship with the cosmos and as an inspiration to life on Earth. Whether true or fiction, right? Myth intertwines itself with the human understanding of the world and is thus indispensable to humanity and the study of it, right? Myth not only exists as story, importantly, but as a fantastical retelling of history. And in no other time did hero or myth flourish as vibrantly than in the heroic age of Greece. Now, before writing, humanity had but one way to remember its history, right? Orally, oral storytelling. So for hundreds and thousands of years, storytellers enraptured audiences with the tales of Achilles, or the tale and the myth of Theseus and Heracles. Though these retellings, right, probably began with the story of a real hero and a real event, over centuries, right, the orators would have perfected their rhapsodies and their performances by adding fantastical details, right, to entertain their audiences, right? So rhapsodies, playwrights, historians, and writers were under this immense pressure, right? That was their living. They were under this immense pressure to captivate their audiences, right? They're entertainers in ancient times. And a failure to do so, a failure to entertain the audience, right, would mean a penniless existence. And thus, right, liberties had to be taken. So these stories, right, which were probably or possibly once history, become so enriched with fantasy that they become the magnificent creative blend that we now call mythology, right? Part fantasy, part history. These stories have inspired countless, innumerable generations to act on courage and to dream that they themselves could achieve greatness, right? We look at these things like the act of the hero, bravery. I'm going to face the Minotaur, right? I'm going to face down the dragon, the Hydra, right? This is all inspiring acts of courage, acts of heroism, acts of masculinity, right? And even feminine heroes too, right? We're now going to look at these myths of the Greeks to remember the fantasy and uncover the history of these great tales of old. Hellas, more commonly known as Greece, produced fantastic poetry, science, art, architecture and democracy. These were a people firing on all cylinders, right? The heroic age of Greece is a time of Mycenaean dominance, right? Of grand wars, of vicious monsters, and great heroes such as Theseus, Jason, Perseus, Heracles, Achilles, and Odysseus. These were just the most notable of heroes produced in an age of Hellenic adventurers, right? This is the Romans would have called Magna Graecia, right? Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, right, is the name given to them by the Romans. It was a time in ancient Greece about 1500 AD to 1000 AD was a time of explorers, settlers, and adventurers, right, for the Greeks. They would embark on expeditions, to give you an idea, that would take them as far as China, right? We now have DNA evidence that the Greeks were in China in ancient times, right? These people were quite simply remarkable, okay? It blows your mind. The heroic, right, explorers, right, these people who went to China, who went to Britain, who went down deep into Africa, all right, into India, were forgotten, right? Their names have been lost to time. But that's because the Greeks did not place as much emphasis on the achievements of explorers as they did on those of warriors, right? This is the ancient Greeks, right, from 800 AD probably back to 1500, 2000 AD or BC are going to be a warrior society, right? But our first explorer we'll look at Dionysus, right? This god, right, Dionysus, is believed to have begun being worshipped around 1500 BC. Dionysus was the god of parties, excess, wine, theater. But he takes on the role of doing strange, incredibly human things. Apparently he's unable to travel in a godly fashion, just teleporting himself wherever he likes. He's actually described as a sailor, right, who conquered the whole world and returned triumphantly to Greece after his conquest, and then was proclaimed a god and worshipped as such. His human quality, right, of being a sailor, of traveling around the world, suggests he might have been an actual man, right, deemed divine upon his return. Importantly, he is mentioned as having gone into Asia, something incredibly important because, believe it or not, when Alexander the Great shows up in India in 327 BC, he writes in his journal of seeing a statue of Dionysus himself there. It's therefore possible that Dionysus was actually an ancient Alexander going forth for conquest, and of course, he is forgotten by time in the end. Jason and the Argonauts, right? A very famous story. A Greek prince is sent, according to a myth, on an impossible suicide mission to reach the kingdom of Phyra, right? To steal the golden fleece at the end of the world, right? We're talking about in the Black Sea, or Anatolia is where this kingdom would be located. He's gone to abscond the golden fleece from. The quest itself is daunting, right? It involves surviving the clashing rocks, according to the myth, of the sea, right? Now, these clashing rocks, right, they're not unreal, right? He has to enter into the Black Sea to go through these clashing rocks. The sea tries to sink them, the stones try to crush them, but Jason and his ship, the Argo, make it past the rocks. When Jason and his crew reach Phyra, the king's daughter Medea helps Jason slay the dreaded Hydra and steal the golden fleece. Right? This story is likely as much based on history as it is fantasy. The heroic age of Greece is fraught with dangerous explorations into unknown lands, right? So this sailing story really encapsulates that. And not only that, but when we look at the description of what's happening, especially of the clashing rocks, the entrance to the Black Sea itself is guarded by the most dangerous strait in the world, right? In 2014, just in the year 2014, this strait claimed 440 ships were sunk in 1 year, right? Trying to get into the Black Sea. So that's a modern ship, right? That's a modern boat. And you take something like the Argo, right? A wooden pentaconter, right? Kind of like a trireme or a galley. Being able to make it through the most dangerous strait in the world is no easy task, right? This is a tremendous achievement, and in the story talking about the clashing rocks perfectly describes this very dangerous Bosphorus Strait that is very difficult to navigate because of all the rocks, the unseen rocks that can bust a hole in your ship and sink you in no time, right? The ship, right? Another clue, right? We're done with the ship. Another clue would be the kingdom of Chalkis, right? Which was, in Hellenic times, the name for the kingdom of Georgia, right? Would now be the kingdom of Georgia that would come later. It would have been established sometime around 2000 BC, Chalkis would. Now, Chalkis was a land laden in gold, iron, and honey, right? And other riches that everyone would have been heavily interested in trading with. And the Greeks were trading with them for a very long time, up until they get conquered by the Persians in 650 BC, right? So we know the Greeks were trading with them, which means they did explore and get there and make contact with them. Now, this is what's interesting. The Chalkian villagers, right, in this corner of the Black Sea that Jason is described to going to, these Chalkian villagers, in order to gather gold, would actually take a ram's hide or fleece and use it as a trap to trap and gather gold in the rivers, right? It is therefore very probable that the golden fleece itself is a metaphor for gold that is collected in this way, and that Jason himself and his Argonauts were plunderers, sailing into Phrygia with his soldiers and stealing treasure, rather than a magical golden fleece itself. Now, the heroes of the Greeks, right, were rewarded with notoriety from their conquest. But what the Greeks, right, this populace of Greeks, this audience, right, wanted most from their orators, their tellers of history and mythology, what they valued most were heroes that slayed fantastic beasts and monsters, right? The difference between the Greeks and their contemporaries is easily displayed, right? The Persians had many mythological monsters, right? Such as the chimeric manticore, and yet most of these monsters were never actually killed by a hero, right? In Egypt, the Sphinx was a potent monster, Egyptian-created monster, right? And wasn't killed by an Egyptian. It doesn't get killed until the legend falls into Greek hands, and then they have a Greek kill it in the mythology, right? So the idea of monster slaying really is a Greek idea. The Greeks are going to come up with this idea of the monster slayer, right? Now, there are some older, right? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see a monster slayer, but the Greeks are really going to take that and are really going to pioneer the monster slaying hero, the idea of that, right? And the interesting thing about the way the Sphinx is killed, right? When we look at the heroic age of Greece and what that means about Greek culture and who these Greeks were, right? We look at the riddle of the Sphinx, right? Oedipus defeats the Sphinx not with a sword, not with a spear, right? Not with an army, but by solving a riddle, right? That's how he kills the Sphinx. That's how he defeats the Sphinx, right? Now, what does that say? Well, it embodies the typical Greek belief that wit is as deadly, if not more deadly, than the sword, right? Or than strength is, right? Most Greek heroes, right, who are associated with this, right? We'll go into this later, but when the Greeks kill their monsters, they don't usually use their strength or brute force to do it. They use their mind, right? And that's a very important, right, societal thing, right? That they're prioritizing wisdom. Right? But the idea of the monster in Greek mythology, right? And it makes sense because most ancient Greek heroes, right, who didn't slay a monster get forgotten, right? And that's probably why when we get much later on, Alexander the Great, right, we know the real story of him, but there's this huge mythology surrounding him of him slaying numerous monsters, right, to characterize him as a Greek hero of old. And that's something that makes a lot of sense, right? It shows the importance of a storyteller adding the defeat of a monster to a hero's resume, right? And it's not for the hero's sake, but it's for the added gratification, right? It gives audiences of this epic struggle against fantastic beasts. The more vile, right, and impressive the monster, the greater the hero, and the louder, therefore, the applause the orator gets, right? But it's important to note, not all monster slayers are immune to time. We have a numerous one: Corabus, Cycreus, Damason, Erebus, Menostratus, and Phobos. Have you ever heard of these people? They're all dragon slayers, believe it or not. They've all been forgotten. Ancient Greek dragon slayers, completely forgotten and lost to time, right? So it's with this idea that we're now going to investigate the warrior heroes of ancient Greece. It is in Crete, in Knossos, where mankind witnesses the very first of the Greek heroes, right? There the queen commits the most atrocious of acts when she mates with the Cretan bull. You heard that right. She mates with a bull. And in doing so, she gives birth to an abomination, half man, half bull. And he's named Asterion, right? Later be called the Minotaur. But this deformed prince Asterion is walled up under the palace by order of their king, the Cretan king Minos, right? There he remains to be appeased by human sacrifices and the thrill of the hunt. Athens, right, was forced to pay tribute, and this would have been in the heroic age time, right, 1000 BC back to 1600 BC. Right? Athens would have been forced to pay tribute to Minos by providing human sacrifices for the Minotaur or Asterion, right? Now, we all know the story. Theseus, a prince of Athens, decides to disguise himself as one of these individuals to be sacrificed, and he enters into the labyrinth and slays the monster, right? And he finds his way out by using a ball of yarn or thread, right, to allow him to follow his tracks so he doesn't get lost in the labyrinth. Now, the legend of the Minotaur seems to be based on a lot of truth, more so than most of these stories. Now, Minoans, as we know, were bull worshippers, right? And indeed, the complex at Knossos, which would have been their capital, right? This giant palace, boasts an impressive labyrinth. The conquerors of the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, we know, continued the bull cult religion of the Minoans. A Linear B tablet found within Knossos reads, 1 jar of honey to all the gods, 1 jar of honey to the mistress of the labyrinth. This tablet written by the Mycenaeans refers to the labyrinth and strongly suggests the name of the palace of Knossos was none other than Labyrinth, right? The actual name of the palace was Labyrinth, right? And that makes sense because labyrinth, labrys, right? The symbol of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, one of their big symbols was a double-headed axe called the labrys, right? And that was their symbol, kind of like their nation's symbol, if you will. One of them was the labrys, right? So you have the labyrinth, right, as the name of the palace. Now, that's just a theory, right? But it is one that makes a lot of sense. The Palace of Knossos is indeed a disorienting maze. It's one of the weirdest buildings in ancient times because it contains 1,000 rooms in this palace, but there are no hallways, right? all the rooms just are block, 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 and they're all connected to each other, which is incredibly odd. And so one room connects to another seemingly infinitely, right? Over 1,000 different connections that could lead any which way, and it would be incredibly confusing and disorienting, and it stacks 5 stories high. So you have 1,000 rooms over 5 stories, and it's just real. It is a maze, and it's absolutely a maze. Now, at the entrance of the gate into the labyrinth, or the palace of Knossos, right, 2 large horns actually protruded from the main gate, right, known as the horns of consecration, right, an important religious symbol to this society. Inside the palace, references to bulls are even more dramatic. There are plenty of frescoes of bulls, ornaments of bulls adorn the entire palace, right? Now, in the legend of the Athenian prince, all right, the Minotaur, right, the Athenians have to pay tribute, right? The Greeks have to pay tribute to this dominant power, right? They have to pay tribute to Minos and his bull, the Minotaur, right? And so this part of the story, the idea of the Athenians having to send sacrificial victims to Minos, is probably true, right? They are, right? It's very likely this is happening because these people, the Cretans, are indeed practicing human sacrifice, right? And we know this because a 1979 expedition into Knossos uncovered the bones of over 300 children, all bearing these telltale signs of human sacrifice, but morbidly also cannibalism, right? So you have this bull cult, right? And the guy's name is Minos, and you got this bull religion, and people are having to go to this palace, which is a maze, and they're having to be sacrificed. They're given a sacrifice, and then they're eaten. Okay? It absolutely makes sense for the Greeks to invent the idea that this is a bull monster, right? That's they have to sacrifice to and get eaten. Because, in a way, this society is a bull monster, metaphorically, right? Now, we know that Crete's trading partner in Canaan engaged heavily in bull worship. Their god Baal, right? With the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, this god Baal, right, was heavily affiliated with human sacrifice, right? It's the number one, right, in the Western world, it's the number one human sacrifice a god or deity, Baal, right, described as a demon in the Bible, all right? And we know that's real, and that they practice it. Now, Baal, we'll show a picture of here, is an anthropomorphic bull statue, right? And it's a bull deity. And it would make a lot of sense if these were connected, if the Cretans adopted the practice of worshiping Baal, and this is the horned creature, the Minotaur, the Greeks were thinking of when they came up with this myth to explain the history, right, that actually occurred here. And we know worship of Baal actually did penetrate into Europe, parts of Italy, some in southern Spain. So this is likely, there's likely a very strong connection here, right? Now, investigating just the name, right? The name of the beast, the Minotaur, is derived from the Cretan king at the time, Minos, right? Who himself was, right? Minos was a worshiper of bulls. That's the religion. Now, the term for Minotaur, Mino meaning Minos, like the name Minos, and Tauros, Minotaur, Taurus, Tor, meaning bull. To add further confusion, right, Minoan coins actually depict a humanoid figure with a bull's head being crowned king. Right. So these later on Cretan coins was perhaps, right, I don't know, perhaps the king wore a bull's mask, right, in some sort of a ritual. This could be for a religious rite. This could be a ceremonial style crown. what we have here, it is very possible that they were wearing the king was wearing that religious symbol we talked about, the horns of consecration, or the head priest was, right? Which indeed could have been the king. Now, helmets imitating bulls, right? Heads, right? Or horns. We think of the Vikings as horn heads, which we all know now that they didn't, horn helmets. The people who actually wore horn helmets, believe it or not, were in fact the Mycenaeans. They're all running around with horn helmets. So, this bull-worshipping society all have horns on their helmets. All their soldiers have horns on their helmets. Their king, it's very likely, wore some sort of horn decoration. And we have human sacrifice and cannibalism in a giant maze here at Knossos. So, and human sacrifice. So, yes, the myth of Theseus in the Minotaur has an abundance of truth to it historically, right? So the evidence suggests not only a bunch of answers, but a lot more questions too. This myth of Theseus and the Minotaur seems to be based on as much history as it is fantasy, right? Now, it is unknown whether the defeat of the Minotaur, right, by Theseus, signifies, right, the Mycenaean conquest of the Minoans, or the Greek conquest, the mainland Greek conquest over the Mycenaeans, right, over Mycenaean dominance, right? So it could either be referring to that, or, in fact, another one, it could be referring to Athens freeing itself from Mycenaean Crete. Right? Suffice it to say, the story of the Minotaur, right, seems to be based on actual events of some truth that time forgot. Cadmus. He's credited as one of the first Greek heroes. He's known for bringing the alphabet and agriculture to Greece from Phoenicia and for founding the city of Thebes, right? He becomes a tragic figure because he slays a dragon, right? And after he slays the dragon, and the gods are angry at him because he slayed this dragon, which was supposed to be a sacred beast that he wasn't supposed to kill, right? So in his grief, Cadmus remarks that if this dragon was so precious to the gods, he might as well wish for the life of a dragon instead. Well, the gods call him out on it, right? One of the earliest examples of be careful what you wish for, because he gets smited and he gets turned into the dragon to replace the one he had killed, right? Now, Cadmus actually appears in Hittite text dating to around 1250 BC, where he is referenced by the Hittites as the forefather of the Mycenaeans. So we have textual evidence by the Hittites that this Cadmus guy might have once been a real figure who got mythology attached to him. And he was said by Homer to live around 2000 BC. Right? Regardless, Thebans, Boeotians, they believed him to be a real person. Right? Let's see, who else should we cover next? Heracles! Okay, we're going to skip Perseus and Bellerophon because, to be honest with you, there's not much truth to those stories, right? We can't dig into the evidence and be like, okay, I see something here. Probably not. Heracles, right? The future king of Argos would become both a Hellenic figure and, in some cults, a god, right? Now, Heracles, after killing his own children in a fit of rage, he was forced to do 12 labors to atone for his sins, right? In the labor, he would kill the dragon Ladon, a lion, a fire-breathing bull. He defeated Cerberus, and he picked golden apples. He did the whole 10 yards, right? But what might make him a real figure here is that in myth, it is stated that Heracles sacked the city of Troy with the help of soldiers years before the Trojan War. Now, what's interesting about this, right, is if we look at the archaeological, well, we look at the mythic record, right, they say that Troy was destroyed 3 times. Once by a sea monster, right, then by Heracles, and then in the Trojan War, all in pretty quick succession. Not that many years from each other, was destroyed 3 times. That's important. Why? Because the archaeological evidence confirms it, surprisingly, right? The first time, right, that archaeological evidence says Troy was destroyed is roughly 1300 BC, right? Archaeologists believe this to be an earthquake. The Greeks believed it to be a sea monster, right? Earthquakes, sea monsters, kind of similar things because you get giant tidal waves coming in when you get an earthquake on the coast, right? So it's interesting they explain the earthquake as a monster, right? Now, in archaeological record 1250 BC, 50 years later, Troy is sacked again, possibly by a real Heracles who, according to the myth, killed all the Trojan royals but spared Priam, right, who would later be the king of Troy during the Trojan War. Now, the last and final time Troy is destroyed, it is in 1190 BC. That would be 60 years later, right, after Heracles destroys it, which is the date that archaeologists give for the Trojan War. Now, according to Homer, Heracles, right, near death, when he died, wished someone to light his funeral pyre, right? The only man brave enough was a fellow named Poeas, right, whom Heracles, to thank him, gave him his bow, right? Poeas' son, excuse my pronunciation, Philocides, is said to have actually wielded this bow that was given to his father by Heracles, right? So he wields this bow in the Trojan War. Now, the dates, this is what's weird, the dates involving Heracles, Troy, the sea monster, they all match up to the archaeological records in the discovery of Troy, right? It also, which really suggests that this could be real, right? That we know Troy was destroyed 3 times in quick successions. The Greeks give explanations for all of it, and it's very possible that Heracles was a real king who once sacked Troy, right? A real Greek king that once sacked Troy, and he gets all this fantasy added to his legend later. But what's interesting about that the Greeks got the timeline for this right is that despite, right, this being passed down orally for nearly 900 years, Homer's dates for the Trojan War are correct and actually correspond with the archaeology. So, oral tradition, right, it seems, despite the injection of all this fantasy and myth, preserves some facts pretty well over very long periods of time. And it's just the difficulty of deciphering what is the fantasy and what is the fact. Now, the final wars, right, the final tales of the heroic age involve a war between the Greeks and Troy, right? The war began when King Menelaus' wife, Helen, was stolen by the Trojan prince Paris and whisked away to Troy. The brother Menelaus, right, another king, the glory-seeking Agamemnon, the most powerful of the Greek kings, it summons all the other Greek kings to go to war with Troy, right? The siege lasts 10 years. In that final year, the hero Achilles slays the Trojan prince Hector and is later killed by an arrow to the heel. The best remembered hero of the Trojan War, right, is Achilles, right? He is a hero. He's a slayer of men. He has divine blood like all the other guys. It's important. All these Greek heroes have divine blood, except for Jason, which is interesting, right? So the prerequisite for any sort of success in Greek society, if you wanted to be a hero, you had to either have divine blood within you, or you had to be blessed by the gods or given a gift by the gods in some way, right? No achievement is possible without the help of the gods, right? It is what they're trying to tell you in ancient Greek society. Any gift, any curse, any victory, any failure, the gods had part in, right? So every Greek hero is either going to be blessed or cursed by Olympus. Now, the Trojan War comes to an end. Who does it? It's not Achilles. It's not this slayer of men. It is Odysseus of Ithaca, right? He fashioned a large wooden horse, the Trojan horse, and faked surrender. The Trojans, pleased with their victory and seeing the wooden horse's tribute, brought the horse within the walls of their city, only to have the Greeks climb out of the hollow wooden horse statue and take the city. Open the main gates, let the armies in. The whole city gets taken. Troy is completely destroyed. All right, now, we know that the Trojan War probably happened, right? This is probably based on reality. All those times Troy's got destroyed, there's burning in the records, in the archaeological evidence, and so it looks like serious warfare took place there, and it is almost without certainty the Greeks that were doing this, and that the Trojan War was indeed a real thing. One of the more amusing things to me is that the people doubt like some of the details in Homer's telling, like, oh, these characters probably weren't real people. First of all, I don't know if you've been aware, right? But, the idea that a prince would steal a king's wife isn't so weird. I don't know if you know this, but men, have a way that the idea of a spouse leaving for another man or another woman, whatever, people cheating on people leaving people for other people, this isn't that fantastical, right? I'm sure you've seen this in your own life, and that really isn't that odd to see one spouse leave their spouse for another person, right? Now, the Trojan Wars, while miraculous and ingenious and indeed an original military tactic, to be honest with you, studying history, there have been plenty of crazy things that people have done in war and tried many wild tactics. So I don't really find the idea of a Trojan horse that ridiculous or outrageous. And in fact, it seems par for the course, right? That somebody would try to do something ridiculous like this, that would try to do something ingenious, an asymmetrical warfare tactic, right? Now, importantly, it was not Achilles' strength that won the Greeks the Trojan War, but Odysseus with his wooden horse, right? It's the mind. The mind is mightier than the sword or brute force, right? And Perseus, we look at Perseus, right? How did he defeat Medusa? Well, in a lot of the stories, right, he defeats Medusa with a mirror. He holds up a mirror to her, and that kills her. He doesn't do it with his sword, right? Jason, how does Jason kill the Hydra? Right? How does he kill this dragon? Not with his sword. He kills it by giving it a sleeping potion and putting it to sleep. Right? That's how he defeats the dragon. Right? Bellerophon and the Chimera, right? Killing the Chimera. The Chimera is defeated with a lead block. He shoves a lead block down its throat, and when the Chimera tries to breathe fire onto him, it suffocates itself. Right? So it was asymmetrical thinking and inventiveness that led to the greatest victories in Greek mythology and we'll talk about it, Greek history too. So as important as strength was to the Greeks, the mind was ultimately more powerful and more valued in Hellenic society. Now that many Greek heroes happened to be kings should not be a surprise, right? We look at later on, around 500 BC, right? And that time was referred to as the Golden Age of Greece. In that time, we have all these Greek city-states, right, competing against each other. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, etc., Thebes. They're all competing against each other with their art, with their architecture, with their inventions, right? And they're enjoying doing so. There's a competition going on between them in these ways. And they're kind of laying claim to their superiority, right, via their artistic achievements and other achievements like that, right? It's therefore not out of the realm of possibility that the powerful states of the heroic age, right, we're talking about 1000 BC to 1500 BC, were competing with each other, not with art, but with heroes. Okay? Now, the superpowers of this era were Mycenae, Argos, Thebes, Corinth, right? And so we have, and Athens, so we have, right, we think of the Greek heroes, we have Theseus, right, who was king and hero of Athens. We have Bellerophon, hero of Corinth. We have Cadmus, hero of Thebes. Perseus, hero of Mycenae. Jason, hero of Thessaly. And Heracles, hero of Argos. Right? Isn't it interesting that each of these heroes is assigned to a city-state? Right? So, like the Greeks of the Golden Age who competed with their art, the Greeks of the heroic age, it would seem, competed with their heroes. Their claim to superiority was their hero, was their myth. Right? So, perhaps once real men and kings of these cities, right, they get signed all these fantastical accomplishments to them to boost not only the legitimacy and the pride of the hero, but the pride of the residence itself, right? The residence of the city, right? So if we're in Argos, the Argosians or whatever they're called, the plural word for that, the people of Argos would say, "We're better than you. We're the descendants of Heracles." Right? Perseus, they would say the people of Mycenae, they would say, we're the descendants of Perseus. We're better than you. That sort of thing. This rivalry is occurring, right? And so these warrior societies, they were all warrior societies, and they're all competing with each other to have the greatest hero, right? To have the greatest heroic myth, because it directly is tied to their masculinity of this warrior society, right? And the political ramifications of this idea of competing to have the best hero would be enormous, right? Who would wage war? Who would not pay tribute to the descendants of Heracles, right? And so their hero, right, this mythological hero, was an icon of their military superiority, broadcast to all who would listen to teach them to fear the men of their city and that they are superior, right? Now, the heroic age of Greece comes to an end with the death of the Mycenaean civilization, right? Here ensues a short dark age that envelops all of Greece. And from the ashes of this dark age comes Athens, Argos, Corinth, Thebes, Sparta would rise up from these ashes to bring about another golden age later on, right? And the myths, despite this dark age, the myths from the heroic age remained, right? Belief in them would not begin to unravel. Like, they believed all this was real. All these stories about Heracles, etc., were all real. These were not myths, they were history to these people. And belief in this stuff would not unravel until well after the coming of Jesus Christ and the conversion to Christianity, right? And even then, of course, they remain incredibly famous myths. Now, the collapse, right, of Mycenae, of the end of the heroic age, right, was followed by numerous city-states embracing different philosophies, right? Some warrior states would arrive, such as Argos, Thebes, or Sparta, but in large part, the arts and the commerce would become the priority, right? Because that makes them money. Now, a non-warrior society, right? If you're a non-warrior society, what need do you have for heroes? Do you have any? No, right? And so we don't see new hero myths popping up, mythology popping up, but with a plethora of mythic heroes from the heroic age, who needs new ones, right? Who needs to create new heroes when we already have them, right? So, but this also correlates with the shift in the recording of history, right? So, the orator's career, right? The entertainer, the storyteller, had been made on embellishment, while the recorder or the writer's devotion was to accuracy, right? And the recorder quickly usurped the orator, and the job of the historian morphed away from merely telling a good story, and accuracy became the primary objective in the field of history. So for all intents and purposes, we get to the golden age of Greece, history is leaving. Once we get to the golden age of Greece in 500 BC, circa 500 BC, history is leaving the realm of the arts, right? And it becoming a field firmly rooted in science by this time. This tradition, this change, right, this transition would be the death knell for mythology and the fantastical details needed to create myth, all right? So from then on, the Greeks would have to embrace the true actions, right, of mortal men, all right, or have no heroes at all, right? So they had to embrace the achievements of real men who did real things, or they would no longer have heroes. And that's a big transition. No more monsters, right? The tragedy of many a myth, right, is that the real histories of these heroes, of these people, of these events has been lost, right? Replaced instead with fantasy. The boon, on the other hand, has been that myths, these fantasies, have inspired generations of people. And especially we're talking about ancient Greece, inspired generations of ancient Greeks to emulate the heroes that these myths were made about. Greek soldiers aspired to be like Achilles, slaying foe after foe. Explorers, right, sought to be like Jason and his Argonauts, sailing beyond the ends of the earth. Oedipus defeated the Sphinx, not with a sword, but with a riddle, inspiring men to think and become philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. Other men were inspired by asymmetrical thinkers and inventors and people who questioned science and sought to make something of it, such as Daedalus and Icarus, right? Who would figure out flight in their myth, right? Which would inspire men like Aristarchus to discover that the earth revolved around the sun nearly 1,000 years before Copernicus did. The result of the Greek myths, and this is their power, was the people that they inspired. They emboldened the Greeks to achieve greatness in every capacity, not just warriors, but explorers, philosophers, inventors, and artists. Men of every type had a god to pray to and a hero to aspire to. What resulted was a Greek society that produced great men and great works and achievements at an unparalleled rate in human history. Many have asked, why are heroes absent from the modern era? It's not that they're not absent. They're here. They're still here. They're only unheralded, right? Long ago, adventurers and warriors were celebrated because they existed in communal warrior societies, right? Communal, key word, right? Today, it is artists and merchants that are celebrated. Entertainers, tech giants, billionaires. Those are the ones who are heralded by our society. All right? And the reason is because modern society is an individualistic one, while the Greeks were a communal one, right? So we have many people across America that are able to achieve incredible things, to do great works, to do heroic acts, to save people from a burning fire, etc. But our society is uninterested in them because we're individualistic. They don't care that they did a great service for others. This guy who saved a bunch of burning people in a church, he doesn't become the hero, right? Because we don't care about other people in that way. We're individualistic. So we look at what can I do for myself? So I'm looking at other people who have done a lot of things for themselves, right? And that's who you aspire to be. We aspire and we put on a pedestal because of this, our entrepreneurs, our musicians, right? Our actors, right? Those are the new heroes, the new celebrities, because we live in a individualistic, capitalistic society, and that's what such a society demands. The Greeks, right? The Greeks were a communal society, a society that worked together, okay? And that is why they valued men and women who did things for their society, what we think of as heroes, who sacrificed something for others, right? Now, the end of the heroic age of Greece is not the end of the Greek heroes. Why? Because they inspired, right? Those Greek myths and myths of heroes inspired real men to do real heroic things. The Persian wars would produce many men of wartime fame, right? Phidippides, excuse me, I mispronounced that, Phidippides would run 26 miles straight, non-stop, to warn the Greeks of the Persian invasion, right? Leonidas of Sparta would famously sacrifice himself in the hot gates to stop the Persian advance. The Athenian commander Themistocles, inspired by that wily Odysseus, ordered the city of Athens to be abandoned during the Persian War. The infuriated Persians went into Athens seeing no one, saying, we can't fight them if they're not here. So they chased the Athenians. But Themistocles had led them on a wild goose chase into a narrow strait where Themistocles had 200 Greek warships waiting for them. This asymmetrical thinking, right, by Themistocles would probably not have been possible without the myth of Odysseus and the priority on mind over brute strength, right? And that is why the Persians were defeated by the Greeks. Wit over bruteness, right? And the result was an enormous victory, probably one of the most important victories, military victories in Western civilization, right? Now, one final hero would arise from Greece before they were eventually conquered by the Romans. That one final hero would be named Alexander the Great, who would become infatuated with the myths of old. He carried a copy of the Iliad with him wherever he went, and he attempted to model himself after Achilles in nearly every fashion, including the looting of the grave of Achilles to get his shield. He wished to become a hero like the tales of old. What he accomplished instead, however, would eclipse them all, right? These old ancient Greek myths had inspired Themistocles to think, to use his mind, and that would cause him to defeat the Persians, right? Defeat this superior force. Alexander was inspired by the Greek heroes of old, and he wanted to live up to them, and so he conquered the known world. Myth is a very important thing, right? And that just goes to show you why. Now, whether any of these heroes, right? So we looked at the truth behind a lot of these Greek heroic myths, but whether these Greek heroes, these mythological heroes, ever existed is entirely irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant, right? Because the importance of these Greek heroes, these mythological heroes, was that people believed in them. It didn't matter if they existed or not, as long as people believed in them, their power would shine through, right? And when people believe in heroes, they often become heroes themselves. No greater example, all right, could ever serve this than Alexander the Great, who modeled himself after the Greek myths of old. So it took one man, right, to be inspired by myths 1,000 years later, after the fact, to turn Greece into the greatest force the world had ever seen and to conquer the known world. So the power of myth has never rested in whether it is real, but in whether it is belief. So may the power of these heroes to inspire the dreams of humanity never fade. Folks, thank you so much for watching. That was our lecture on the heroic age of Greece. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, the heroic age of Greece, 1000 to about 1500 BC, when all these mythological heroes supposedly existed. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this fascinating. I certainly did. You all have a great rest of your day.